Well, hello and a big welcome to our BPF event today and to all of you on the screen. Our event today, as you all know, is on Labour's first 100 days and what that means for our sector and for our members. Thank you all for joining. This is an event run by the BPF Futures, which for those of you who don't know, it's the next generation part of the BPF. We've got 3,000 members, which is great, and they're all with people who have 10 years or under experience in their careers. But we're also very pleased to have lots of other BPF members from across the organisation here as well today. Very quickly, I'm Craig Warman, and I'm the head of public affairs at a fund manager called Delancey, and I sit on the BPF Futures advisory board. If you do have any colleagues with under 10 years experience, please do encourage them to sign up, and they'll get lots of other opportunities to join networking and events like this today and training. We've got a very exciting lineup today. We've got some great political experts who I will introduce very shortly, but I'll quickly just set out how we're going to use today. We're going to have a presentation by a strategic communications consultancy called Portland, and they're going to introduce some insights and some analysis for the next 30 minutes. We'll look at the new Labour government, we'll look at the King's speech, and we'll look at what that means for you as our BPF members. We'll then hear from the BPF themselves on what they've been doing with Labour and how they're supporting our sector with this new government. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so please do drop all your questions into the chat function and we'll throw them at the panel a bit later. So we're going to kick off with some introductions. I'll kick off with Gabriel first. So Gabriel Milland joins us from Portland, where he leads the research practice. He advises with the world's biggest businesses on media, government relations. He's actually a former political correspondent and foreign editor of The Express, before moving into government, where he led communications teams at 3 major Whitehall departments. His last role in government was as special advisor to then Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Downing Street, where he helped lead on the UK's response to COVID. We're also joined by Anita Boateng, who also joins us from Portland, and she is a policy and public affairs partner there. She has served 3 different cabinet ministers as a government special advisor from 2016 to 2019, including the Deputy Prime Minister, the Lord Chancellor, and the Work and Pensions Secretary. So she's been very busy with advising lots of different government ministers. She's also very interestingly formerly producer of BBC Question Time, and she's a political commentator where you can watch her regularly on places like Sky News. She was also a parliamentary candidate for Bridgend at the general election, so hopefully lots of insights into what it was like on the doorstep as a candidate. And last but not least, we have Dominic Curran, who is the head of communications at the BPF. Dominic's got over a decade of experience in property. He was formerly a policy lead at the British Retail Consortium. He's worked in housing policy at the Greater London Authority under 2 different mayors. And he's also worked on behalf of lots of local authorities on planning matters, as well as a big stint in the Houses of Parliament. So we have lots of experts here today. I think it's going to be a great session. So huge welcome and thank you to our panelists. And Portland, we're going to hand over to you for your presentation.
So what we're going to do is talk to you about Labour, all things Labour, kicking off with talking about the general election, but also, as Craig said, the King's speech and sort of specifics for the sector. Now, we do know there's Q&A at the end, but we always very much enjoy questions and comments. So I think we can see, or Craig can see, if you raise your hand, and we'd really, really welcome thoughts and reflections as we go on, because sometimes you get a great question and it goes out of your head and it doesn't feel as timely at the end of 30 minutes, which is a long time. So without further ado, let's start by talking about the Labour Party and the general election.
I think I'm going to do this bit. Thanks, Craig, and hi, everybody. Thanks for giving us your lunchtime. And it's always great to see Craig, who was a fantastic colleague back when he was with us, sadly missed. So obviously, you know, everyone knows what kind of happened in the general election. Basically, it was a massive Labour landslide. Labour's vote share was down on previous figures, but that was mainly to do with the fact that, unlike in 2017, 2019, lots of voters were not so completely terrified of Jeremy Corbyn that they were prepared to vote for literally anybody else, including the Conservative Party, compared to Labour Party. So don't, you know, not that anyone here probably necessarily does, but, you know, don't underestimate the degree of triumph that Labour had early this month. It was a stunning result on the outcome that matters, that is seats. Obviously, some other noteworthy things that are going to be important and which everyone will be aware of. So if I'm stating the obvious, just to emphasise that these are really important things. First, the number of Lib Dem MPs up massively, 71 Lib Dem MPs, up from, what was it, 9 elected in 2019, 11, something like that, 14 by the end of the Parliament. Enormous. That's going to make a big difference in the House of Commons, huge difference in the House of Commons. And we're still not entirely sure how things like questions at PMQs are going to be divvied up, etc. And the Tories are in a dreadful state. There's no way around it at all. There's no way of putting any spin on this. They are, they look a bit like survivors from the Titanic at the moment. They're kind of in a state of dazed. Liz Truss is going off and saying various mad things at various places. They're going to have an election campaign that will be the usual Tory fratricide stroke sororicide, and they don't have an idea of who they actually are as a party anymore. Partly that's because Reform did relatively well, although only about as well as UKIP did in 2015, about 15% of the vote, when the Tories, of course, got a majority in 2015, a small one, but a majority nonetheless. So the idea that this is some kind of massive surge for Nigel Farage's particular blend of politics is easily overdone. Some other things that are worth noting about, obviously, the Greens. There are two Green parties, in effect. There are the Watermelon Greens, who won in Bristol, who are green on the outside, red on the inside, and are many of them veterans of Corbyn Labour Party from the hard left. And then there are your Mango Greens as well, and those are of particular importance, I think, perhaps to you guys. And they are the NIMBY-ish sort. People like Adrian Ramsey, who got himself into such bother yesterday, who are green on the outside, but deep, deep yellow on the inside. And effectively, they're kind of vegetarian Lib Dems. That's how I describe them. So, Labour have an insurmountable majority. They have a formidable political and electoral machine. They have some very good operators, and they've had a decent fortnight, And in terms of where the government is, look, I mean, who reads polls at this stage in a parliament, 2 weeks into a parliament? But everything suggests that the public are determined to give them a decent win. There is a honeymoon period, etc. And the Lib Dems have been deadly quiet over the last fortnight, and the Tories have just been saying random stuff, which was effectively what they said during the campaign as well. One thing I would say very quickly is, how did Labour win, and how did the Tories lose? Labour won, and I've done a lot of polling on this that is potentially of interest. Labour won because, and what this means in terms of how they're going to govern and what the decisions that they're going to make. Labour won by being not incompetent and by emphasising health, and the Tories lost by being incompetent and losing the trust of the British people on the public services. And the work that I've done in terms of how people voted Labour and why people voted Labour and why people didn't vote Labour is what they want from this government, more than anything else, more than the houses being built, more even than the economy being put on the right track, more even than generally governing in a grown-up and more disciplined way, which is, ranked highly, is they want the public services, particularly the NHS, to be put back together. That's a kind of overview of where we are politically and where we've washed up.
Great. I have one thing just to add, and I'm pleased if you've got particular questions on the election result, now is your moment to pipe up with the question. So just one thing on this, we're looking at this chart, and we deliberately chose this one to see the kind of dramatic nature of Labour's majority. But one of the factors in that is that you do have quite a lot of people who 4 months ago, 6 months ago, weren't particularly expecting to make it into the House of Commons. And in that, there is some inexperience. So you have a kind of group that is very much kind of stars, and we might talk about some of those that are particularly relevant for the built sector. And then you have a lot of people who are local champions, I would call them, former councillors, maybe leaders of their councils, who are really, really well effective and good at that. but very much have their experience in that vein, and they are therefore probably slightly more nervous than some of your standard MPs that have come in and are a bit more hardened or a bit more with their eyes on, I don't know, a ministerial prize. And that does add to when you bring in the kind of Lib Dems and the Greens that are number 2 in lots of places, this challenge over development, which although Labour are, obviously going to try to quote unquote stack the deck to ensure there's much more development, and also is making kind of noises on things like rent reform, which is back in following the King's Speech, there is still this element of, as I'm sure you've all dealt with many times before, of NIMBYism that we think the MPs will actually be annoyingly probably more sensitive to. When you're experienced and you've been in your seat a long time and you're used to these kind of local campaigns, it's a very different thing to if you're slightly, even if you're in a fairly comfortable position, looking over your shoulder at the Greens or the Independents or Reform or the Lib Dems, who can sometimes play that opposition to development game when it suits them.
I think that's a really important point that Anita made. And we saw this after 2019 as well. There are a lot of Tory MPs who had very little political scar tissue. And so the first time they got a kind of hostile email inbox or, post bag, they panicked. And there'll be some of that with Labour for sure. There will be some of that. And there are parts of the country that are not used to having Labour MPs at all, where the Labour Party is not a simple cultural fit, that are going to have, there are going to be some windy MPs out there who are going to be quite amenable to noisy letter writers.
Right. So then what does this mean for the broader policy context? Politics, I mean, Gabriel said it, there's been 2 weeks where, you don't look at the polls, but generally there's a sense of momentum, there's a sense of confidence. And I think that number, or that 411 number, is a huge part of that. And also that it's a huge vindication of their political strategy, not just of their campaigning nows. And so you do have a government that feels more able to take risks or make difficult decisions, insofar as Starmer, a risk for Starmer, that wouldn't be a kind of Boris Johnson-esque swing, someone who favoured going for big punts. But still, this is a Labour Party with a lot of confidence and feeling like they have a mandate to deliver on their plans and their manifesto and their way of governing. The second thing that I've sort of basically alluded to some of those kind of local champions, but there are also a huge number of Starmer loyalists in the parliamentary party. We would call it a tribe. And there isn't a sort of ideology that links them together, although they're kind of broadly, I would call them kind of more on the centrist wing of the Labour Party. But also they tend to have been in some way connected to the Labour Party for quite a long time, normally by working in offices of other kind of significant figures, now probably ministers or cabinet ministers, being, part of political dynasties, daughters of, sons of former MPs and thinkers, and also, or having been like really plugged into the centre of the Labour Party. So there is a kind of core tribe of Starmer loyalists who will feel like they owe their position to Starmer. And then the final thing that we are, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about, is this mission-led government. And it's interesting that they've put together some like apparatus to kind of support the delivery of this with these Whitehall mission boards, basically like cross-cabinet committees that would normally be chaired by Starmer or maybe Pat McFadden or Rayner or Reeves, and we're seeing trickling out some of the positions for those 5 mission boards. And the idea here is really just to coordinate what's going on in government. And when I worked for the Deputy Prime Minister, he chaired a lot of these on things like Brexit preparedness. Who remembers that? But it's really about pulling together all the different strands of Whitehall and ensuring mostly there's political oversight and political, heft behind some of the things that Starmer wants to achieve. It's not going to change the world. They've been used many times before, but a signal of their intention to ensure there's more coordination for those things they really want to achieve. I think there's a question. It's about the US, so maybe we'll do that as we go along. I'll pause there for any more questions or anything related to the politics of this new operating context. No. We carry on. Great. Inside the Labour Party, so we don't want to just give you a complete rundown of all sorts of names, although we will give you a few. Just a few that maybe you haven't heard about, who I don't think have been spoken about enough. So, you know, Sue Gray is top of everyone's list and on everyone's lips as the new Chief of Staff. And I worked with Sue. I'm not sure, Gabriel, if you worked with Sue as well. But yeah, she's very much a formidable Whitehall figure who knows Whitehall inside and out and is a fixer and a doer and very much is good at unblocking things when there are issues with delivery in Whitehall. So I think she has a great many strengths. The thing she isn't, obviously, is political. And the other thing she isn't is necessarily someone who she's someone who knows how to use the machine of politics, but that's not a party instinct. And I think that almost that formidable combination of needing to understand how to use Whitehall, which he definitely has, needing to understand the party to some extent, and needing to see the politics, i.e. what's going to be in the front pages, what are the things and how they're going to play out. Now, she definitely probably doesn't bring as much on those two fronts, but for that, he really has people like Morgan McSweeney, who, you know, is called Starmer's political brain. And those two, I think, together, and although there's been some tensions, it seemed to have sort of worked its way out, are going to be a really important combination of influencers behind Starmer. But the one that hasn't been spoken about, in my view, enough is Pat McFadden, who is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which is my old boss's role in the Cabinet Office, where you kind of, you know, it's a job that every time someone new comes in, they get basically a new job description. But his role, he is so trusted in Labour by pretty much everyone on every level. He's very experienced, a former special advisor, and is someone who was critical in the campaign, led the party's campaign, and is again a massive fixer. So I think that role is going to basically function, I wonder, like an effective deputy prime minister in terms of ensuring that delivery. Obviously, there's Reeves. Obviously, there's Angela Rayner, who we'll talk about in more detail. But I'll pause there, Gabriel, for any reflections on that core centre around Starmer.
What I would add, emphasise with Sue is that Sue's fundamental skill set is something that is highly prized amongst very senior officials. Is, you know, precisely as Anita said, she's a fixer. You know, she's someone who can make problems go away. Or you know, or kind of put a finger in the air and sense, is this a problem that we need to fix now? You know, does this person have to be whacked or whatever? What she isn't is she's not an administrator, and she's not a policy person massively either. She's a power broker and a deal maker, and I think, you know, she's never delivered a big reform program. Etc. You know, she was brought into CLG by Michael Gove, my old boss, to, you know, to bang heads together. You know, if Andy Burnham needs this, this is what Andy Burnham's, you know, going to get, whatever. So that's the way to see her. Morgan's really important. Morgan's one of the most political people I've ever come across in my life. You know, he lives and breathes politics. Every single inch of him is consumed by politics, by winning particularly, and by despising the far left, which is a really important part of his makeup.
Great. And then on to the, Craig, were you about to come in?
Anita, I was going to ask, how much do we think that this experience and this sort of those quad that they've referred to it of ministers in his team are going to help him deliver on his missions? I know we've heard from Tory governments in the past about Whitehall. We heard from Dominic Cummings as recently as this week about how Keir's still going to come across the same sort of challenges that Conservative governments have had. But what do you guys, what's your opinion on how much actually this new experience and this new way of working can help them get the job done?
If I could butt into that, I mean, I worked very closely with Dominic from 2011 until 2014, and then again in Downing Street. He's right. I draw your attention to Duncan Robertson's piece in The Economist this week, which is excellent, on the importance of getting shit done. Now, the civil service is not, God love it, I've got a lot of admiration. I was a senior civil servant myself for many years. I got a lot of respect for it. But one of my concerns for this government is that the civil service are not necessarily their friends in terms of getting shit done. And, you know, this kind of, you need to be slightly cynical about very senior civil servants' motivations sometimes. You know, they're not massive fans of reform. They have a vested interest in the status quo a lot of the time. And there's going to have to be some I think the signs are pretty good. I mean, there are some really determined ministers. I mean, Matthew Pennycook at MHCLG is underrated, for example, as a minister. You've got a lot of people who've got serious experience in local government, for example, as well in Labour. And I think as well, we'll go on to this probably as well, people with serious experience in devolution will be influential in Labour as well. My concern is that the forces of conservatism lurk deep within Whitehall. So to take something completely unrelated to property, but I think is representative of where they find themselves. There is and Duncan writes about this in The Economist, but I've been thinking about it in the last 10 days or so. You know, there is this enormous problem at the Department for Transport with driving tests. No one can get a driving test because the system has been so badly designed that arbitrageurs are buying them up, speculators are buying them up and doling them out, selling them on Facebook. So it takes 6 months to get a driving test, which is, you know, there are people who urgently need to drive, work or family reasons or whatever. The thing, you know, what would Don do in this situation? In terms of running a department, I think, or what would Michael Gove do in this situation? You know, calling the permanent, being the Department for Transport, calling the permanent secretary, the relevant director general, the CEO of the Driver Vehicle Standards Agency, whatever it is, and say, sort this by Tuesday. And I see no sign of that happening. So, you know, that makes me slightly concerned about. Again, that they're going to get just sort of, you know, it's like wading through treacle.
Yeah, and I think we can see this actually in the number of kind of, we're going to review this issue, which I think reviews make sense, right? Of course they do. You have to make sure you have all the facts at hand. But some of these decisions are just difficult. And there's nothing that you're going to discover in the politics or in the finances that are going to make any of those decisions any easier. And the thing that's really interesting about Sue is, like, I've seen and spoken to many shadow cabinet ministers who have said how valuable Sue has been behind the scenes in the run up to the election, of helping them understand and figure out their plans for government. In government, you sort of have a chief of staff, and then you're going to have probably a new cabinet secretary who's also sort of going to have the similar experience to Sue. So it's like that political bit is really what you're going to need. And that's where I think the quad is going to be particularly helpful, especially Pat and especially Rachel, because although Angela has probably the most, of that four, is the most political, probably, and most ideological, perhaps. She's maybe the one that has Starmer's ear the least, I would suggest. So I think there's going to be an interesting tension. And I suspect that the quad stuff is not going to be a formalized process. I think it's an indication of where power lies, rather than something that becomes effectively like the coalition's quad between Danny Alexander and Nick Clegg and George Osborne and David Cameron. So.
All four of those were also ministers as well. Stu is not a minister, neither is Morgan. There's one thing that, you know, that grows when you're in government, and people can become terribly grand. And they say, you know, Stu, you're just a hired help. I'm a minister, you know, and I think that might start interfering as well.
Yeah, we've already seen the briefings of Sue being like, why is she able to decide this? So yes, that will definitely be a factor. And so just on the built environment decision makers, I mean, I could talk all day, probably for the next half an hour, and I only have probably 5 minutes left on Angela Rayner. I think that what's the most important thing to understand about Angela Rayner is she's passionate about many things. I wouldn't necessarily say that housing in general or development is one of them. And I think she's clearly wanting to keep half an eye, or well, more than half an eye on the New Deal for working people. She's very interested in devolution. She's very interested in social housing, but that doesn't cover, as you all know, the wide gamut of things that developers work on. And actually, housing is really only one very small component of that. So the thing that Angela has is she is Deputy Prime Minister. She has political weight and she can use it, but it's finding ways to engage her in this issue and make her a lover and champion of the sector, and to see it as being very integral to the government's overall mission. And I think Reeves has made that step and made it emphatically. It's whether Angela has, I think, happily, and she is quite comfortable leaving quite a lot of stuff to Matthew, which, as you know, Gabriel says, who's highly rated, really getting on with it, already reaching out to businesses, some of whom may be on the call, to get some early thoughts. All of that is really positive, and a sign that he still sees as being very much in partnership with the sector, but you maybe don't have a Secretary of State for whom this is the thing that gets him out of bed in the morning.
I think the best way of understanding Angela is that she's a unison official. I'm a huge fan of her, enormous fan of her in all sorts of ways. But I think the way to understand her is that her fundamental professional political formation came as a unison official. Which there are many great things about that. She's a deal maker. You know, what do trade unionists do when they go in for discussion with employers? You know, there's quid pro quo. You know, you want this, I want this, I can deliver this for my members, you need this, you know, etc. She
loves a deal.
That is the best way of understanding her. She's a deal maker and she's pragmatic.
100%. And you may all have further questions about some of these figures. Nick Williams is great, and knows and is keen to learn when it comes to some of the detail of planning. Joe Knight used to work on some of planning, but also has worked in Reeves's team doing economics, so is good at kind of understanding the benefits of the kind of growth part of the story that we want to tell. Obviously, we've got people like Melanie, and we have you know, back in the Commons, and also people like Luke Murphy. I think there are some housing people who are passionate about housing, but really more who've written extensively about the rental sector, for instance, rental reform, and have some interest in affordable housing, rather than, as we talked about, the kind of commercial sector, or you know, commercial property or renting, or all those other things that that people on this call will be dealing with. So I think there's some experience here and some interest, but Reeves has really done more for this sector than I think most people are going to, in seeing it as central to how you deliver growth and making it central to the government's mission. I think we're rapidly running out of time, so I may not go through all the bills from the King's Speech, but maybe, Gabriel, if you talk through some of the kind of big themes coming through from the King's Speech.
Okay, well, I mean, the big thing, you know, planning is seen as the key lever, the key initial lever, because it literally is something that can be done with the stroke of a pen in a Whitehall department, as we saw, for example, with, you know, some solar developments over the last week or so. But it absolutely is seen as a way of unlocking growth, and growth is just so important. It's stating the obvious here. It's just so important, delivering growth, and so it's much quicker to do that with some quick reforms on planning that is the other things that are needed to unlock growth, which are going to take decades to pan out. Skills policy, for example, you know, you make skills policy change now, you might feel the benefit in 10 years' time, etc. But in terms of some quick calories, planning is completely key. Keep an open mind. I've done quite a lot of polling around expectations on tax, and including with people who previously voted Tory and voted Labour in 2024, and those voters are, the majority of them are okay with the idea of taxes going up, some taxes going up. It's not a bigger deal breaker. I think there is more, and we created something called a jeopardy index on this, which showed that there is more political jeopardy in not fixing the NHS and other public services than there is in not putting out taxes. Particularly, that's taxes that ordinary people don't pay: CGT, corporation tax, etc. I mean, some ordinary people pay CGT, You know, it's a bit touchy subject for Angela herself at one point, obviously. But that, you know, I just got a feeling in my bones more than anything else that they might make a move on tax. And this is why the budget in about 3 weeks' time is incredibly important, more important than the King's Speech, possibly, because that will really show the direction of fiscal and monetary travel as well. I was a member of the Labour Party for a long time before I became a civil servant, and then sort of fell amongst Tories. But don't underestimate the degree to which Labour really believes things on workers' rights. It's really important. It's what Labour Party members feel. But there is also a very naked political deal being made with the rest of the Labour movement, i.e. the trade unions, which is basically you stay out of politics in a way that the unions failed to do under Corbyn, who was, you know, a Unite project, and we'll give you greater scope and power in the industrial context. So stay out of politics and we will build up your role in the workplace. That's the deal that's been done. So, you know, the workers' rights stuff, and this is Angela again, as a former Unison trade union official, is really, really important. And that is completely baked in. They're not going to be going anywhere on that. There's one other thing that I can't quite see because of the way that there's going to be, as Anita suggested, there's going to be a lot of reviews and consultations. And that means that now is the time to engage. You know, there is Starmer himself was a former senior official, you know, he's DPP. He loves a bit of process and he is cautious as well. So reviews, etc., are going to be the way that this government does stuff. There's going to be lots of them. Also, there's a kind of bring out your dead attitude towards a lot of problems as well, where they want to get it all out on the table early. So now is the time to engage, absolutely, and to get under the skin of what this government wants and what it wants from its partners and what you can offer as well.
Great. And that's exactly where we wanted to leave it, with the fact that, you know, that wanting to work with business is not just a rhetorical device that Labour have used. They really do see that as a key of, you know, driving investment in the right directions, really fixing problems, as Gabriel says, and working in partnership, wanting to be a bit of a quid pro quo. We've talked about the deal makers in government. But that really provides an opportunity. So I think we're handing over now to Dominic to talk through what the BPF has been doing on that front.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Anita and Gabriel. I'm just going to share my screen. Just a couple of reflections first on what you were saying. I mean, I think it was all absolutely correct, and I completely agree. I thought there was an interesting moment, must have been last week, or maybe even earlier this week, where the Green co-leader opposed some electricity pylons in his constituency, which were going to carry green energy from one part of somewhere to another part of somewhere. But it was just an interesting example of putting local constituents first, even for the Green Party. So I completely take your point about the challenge between principle and pragmatism there. And allied to that, it's notable that the average majority size is at its smallest for a very long time for all MPs. So I think there will be an issue with many MPs looking over their shoulders, although that majority is clearly partly driven by the multiplicity of parties that we now have, and the way the votes went in the last election. And I think we now have the highest ever number of opposition parties in Parliament, I think at 13. And my one other reflection, just before I launch into what the BPF has been doing in terms of advocacy for the sector and lobbying of MPs, is that we actually have the first Prime Minister ever who has previously managed a large public sector organisation, which I will take as a good thing, and possibly a bad thing that we've never had somebody with that experience before in that role. But I think it may lend an interesting lens into how he manages the process and machinery of government. So just to step back a little bit, we launched our manifesto back in January. We were cognizant of the possibility of a May election. It's called Building Our Future. We did a pretty good write-ups at the time during the election. The editor of Property Week said it was clearly written and well worth a read. I would heartily endorse that 5-star review. And we followed it up with, excuse me, my voice is going, so hopefully it will last for the duration of this presentation. We followed it up with 5 what we called sector-specific manifestos during the election, one on retail, logistics, housing, planning, and finally carbon or sustainability. And those fleshed out and reflected the 4 pillars that we'd set out in our campaigning. And what we wanted to do in putting forward the industry's message to politicians was not just set out what we as an industry do across the piece, but also frame it in such ways so that it had resonance for politicians and also in terms in the wider public. And that's not because we expect or expected members of the public to read the manifesto, but rather that we wanted politicians to be able to understand what we were saying in the context of what they might hear on the doorsteps or pick up as major issues. So the 4 sort of pillars were around productivity and growth, recognizing early on that that was going to be Labour's sort of key theme, as you were saying, Gabriel. And a lot of our recommendations for planning reform sat in that chapter. Then building more homes, clearly another huge priority for Labour and really all the political parties. In fact, all of these are across political parties, but we clearly had one eye as to who might be the likely winner after the election. Building stronger town centres and the role that property developers can play in injecting, particularly importantly, capital into town centre regeneration. And then what we can do to decarbonise the commercial built environment primarily, but how that plays into the broader net zero target. During the election, we assessed all of the candidates and made an assessment as to how likely they were to win. We have a, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, caucus of around 50 MPs. Happily, both those 2 that you mentioned, Anita, are on our list of MPs that either have experience or interest in the built environment. It is striking just how few Labour MPs have any private sector business experience. One might say it was always thus, but it seems to be more pronounced than in previous years. That said, a reasonable minority have come directly from housing associations or have a housing association background. I think there's about 10 or so with that background. And as you said, Anita and Gabriel, a reasonably large number have come from being cabinet members in councils or leaders of councils, usually with a very strong development or regeneration perspective. And I think in terms of also the political dynasty you were mentioning, Anita, clearly Georgia Gould kind of embodies all of that, being Philip Gould's daughter. So that was the sort of one lens through which we looked at likely winning MPs and those who have now won. But the other lens through which we looked at possible engagement was looking at where our members' assets were held across the country. So we mapped them by parliamentary constituency. Here's a sort of screenshot of how that looked. And so when we reach out to MPs, or we shall use this as a way of reaching out to MPs to say, you know, you have a retail park, a business park, whatever it might be in your constituency, we'd love to come and talk to you about that and what we can do to support greater investment. So we're kind of looking at it through both an MP's background and personal interest and also their constituency interest, and that will help guide engagement with backbench MPs. But of course, that's not the only engagement we're doing. We are in communication with ministers and now the new shadow ministers. We were engaging with people like Matt Pennycook and Angela Rayner before the election. Our chief executive, Melanie, had a call with Matt last week once he was sort of settled into his new role, if you can be settled after 4 days. And we essentially reiterated the BPF's position, which is that we want to do work on all of those 4 pillars. Our members do work on those 4 pillars as their, if you like, day job. In some cases, they've been doing that for literally centuries. The industry broadly has not just the experience, but in many ways the capacity and particularly in some parts of it, the capital to bring to bear really significant change and economic growth across the piece, across the UK. In a whole range of areas. And, you know, we want to reset that relationship between the industry and government to help make that happen. So we're drawing up a document of asks, which is really reframing our manifesto asks, and we're looking at a launch event for that in the coming months. And we're looking at setting up a series of receptions for this group of around 50 MPs that we've reached out to help, I suppose, help them understand, help them appreciate what the industry does across the piece. So not just in housing, although that's clearly where a large part of the interest is, but also in terms of logistics or mixed-use development or industrial. And it's encouraging, as Gabriel and Anita have said, there has been a lot of action quite early on from the government. So within 3 days, Angela Rayner had called in a couple of data centres in Greenbelt land in Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire. They lifted the ban on onshore wind. Rachel Reeves gave a speech the Monday after the election, reiterating the focus on growth and planning reform. And we have an imminent review of the NPPF consultation, for which we've been told will be launched by the end of the month. So most likely next week or early the week after. So they're clearly wanting to get on. I think that point about planning being the lever to pull is absolutely right. It is a lever that you can pull without legislation in many ways, or many aspects of it. And it's also something you have to pull early because it takes so long for the whole process to filter through. So clearly there are lots of reasons why they are focusing on that as a sort of first 100 days objective. As was alluded to, the King's Speech yesterday, 10 out of the 40 bills touched on real estate, although 3 were really heavily focused on our sector: the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, the Renters' Rights Bill, and the Draft Leasehold and Common Hold Bill. I suppose the good thing in one sense is that there weren't really many surprises in any of those. They were things Labour had talked about and been in the manifesto. In a sense, we were speaking to the FT yesterday after the King's Speech, and he said this makes really bad copy for us, but it probably makes for good government. And I think that was probably right, and that's probably where the government want to be. I think they want to avoid some of the what was it? Keir Starmer call it performative politics of recent years. Planning Infrastructure Bill, it will be interesting to see what is in the detail. As ever, the accompanying notes for the King's Speech rarely give you a deep insight into what the detail is of what's being planned. With planning, the detail is absolutely crucial. There was one slightly intriguing and new clause or element to that bill, which was modernising planning committees. Modernising is in the eye of the beholder, so we will wait to see what that actually means in practice. Does it mean reducing the power of elected members? Does it mean making them work in a different way? We shall have to see. My hunch is that and it has been much talked about, is that now that we have so many MPs being from the government, 2 out of 3 MPs nearly are Labour. Yes, there are a lot of seats that they now hold, perhaps for the first time ever, which are, if you like, traditional Conservative seats, and perhaps have a less pro-development stance, arguably. But I suspect that the desire to get to that 1.5 million target at the central, sort of in terms of number 10's view, will significantly outweigh the desire to please local constituents or please MPs representing constituents who might be otherwise upset by planning reform changes. And to Gabriel's jeopardy index, I think the risk of not achieving 1.5 or getting as damned close as possible to it is going to be bigger for Labour than satisfying backbench MPs who have angry constituents. We shall see how that plays out over the coming years. Renters' Rights Bill largely picks up where the Rental Reform Bill fell at the last session. I suspect we won't see the same commitment to court reform preceding any abolition of Section 21, which is a disappointment. But there are, again, not really any surprises there. And it's also welcome in terms of the leasehold reform and freehold reform to see that it will be a draft bill. This is a complicated area. It is right the government proceeds carefully and listens to I think the very reasonable concerns of the large, for example, pension funds that hold a lot of freeholds, and we make sure that that process, if it is to be unwound, unwinds in a way that doesn't harm actually our ability to get pensions paid out. I won't go through the detail of the other bills, but a lot of them touch on what our members are doing and the sort of broader built environment, and we'll be paying a lot of attention to those as they come up. I just want to sort of finish on one point. There was this slightly Orwellian phrase from, I think it was Angela Rayner, stability has changed, but it alludes to what I was saying earlier, that whilst there weren't really any particular surprises in the King's speech, and not really any surprises so far in terms of announcements across the piece for the real estate sector, actually, arguably, that is change. And so that point that the FT made, that it makes for bad copy for them, I'm personally fine with that. And if we can keep people like Matt Pennycook in place, and I think he probably wants to stay in place for the long term, that's all to the good. And if you like, that's actually the cheapest thing the government can do, is just keep people in place, have a policy direction and stick to it for 5 or more years. That would in itself be of enormous value. The issues that certainly members talk to me about are also the issues that government is focused on. There is a lot to do in planning reform. It's not just about resource. It's not just about policy. It's about the entire culture of local planning departments. And that's going to take a lot of time and effort to get right. It's good to see also the government proceeding at pace on new towns. There was the announcement by Angela Rayner at UK Reef about setting up the new towns task force. I suspect they could probably get on and do a lot of it without a task force. So I'd hope to see some work proceeding in parallel with a process of local site volunteering and assessment. I think there are some sites that are probably ready to go, although of course, define new town. Is it an urban extension? Is it a development over a certain number of homes? I was speaking to somebody at Homes England a few months ago who said, we're actually working on 47 large urban settlements under different bits of legislation. And it's, we're not allowed to call them new towns because that upsets our political masters, but there are actually 47 being actively worked on at the moment. So there may be an issue of rebadging, I suspect. I suppose the dog that didn't bark really was business rates, and the government have, or the Labour Party in opposition talked about and have committed to replacing business rates. Lots of speculation as to what that means. Is it going to be a sort of rebadging? Is it going to be a rebalancing with some sort of online sales tax or delivery charge? We don't know. I'm not sure that Labour necessarily know. We are involved with the CBI's business rates working group, who are plugged into conversations about this. I suspect, despite the fears of some of our members, that this may result in land value taxation, which generally by design falls on the property or landowner rather than the occupier, which does cause some concern for some of our members. I suspect that a move to LVT is even for a party with a 170 whatever it is majority and probably 2 terms in power, I suspect that is a too big and too difficult a change to deal with and goes in the too hard bucket, and they will probably tinker around with some of the reliefs and the structure of the multiplier and perhaps leave it there. But who knows? I may be proved wrong. I will leave it there.
Thank you.
That was the end, so you didn't have to wind me up.
No. I was going to say a big thank you. It's so interesting to see what you've been doing, and it was great that we were, as a sector, prepared for the early election, which was great. We'll move on to some Q&As. We've started to get a couple through, which is great. Please do, if there's anything from throughout the session earlier that you want to ask, please get your questions in. We've got polling experts, former government experts, parliamentary candidates. So if there's anything either related to the presentation or more broadly about those, do chuck in your questions. The first one here is signals from Labour and opposition, and in the early days of this new government, have been relatively warm, but there'll undoubtedly be bumps in the road for our sector. What does the panel think will be the first test for the honeymoon period?
Oh, great question. So I have this whole theory, right? So I talked about the fact that Labour, when they say wanting to work in partnership with business, they really mean it. But I also think, what Dominic just said there about, stability is change. that Labour has this idea that if you just come in and you sort of just don't change things and you're not incompetent, then everything goes amazingly well. And in particular, you know, why is planning reform so difficult? Because actually a lot of local people don't like planning, do not like development, and there is no politics that's going to overcome that fundamental issue, regardless of the colour of people's rosettes. And so what I think, my big kind of watch out is really that if we don't see a material change to the levels of growth or investment or in jobs in the next year, and Labour has clearly given itself a sort of year to be able to pump more money into public services, I think you then pull the, as Gabriel says, I mean, there'll be some taxation changes I am expecting in the budget, but I think next year's budget could end up being with a lot more of a focus on possibly business taxes as a less politically painful way to raise money for the public services, which like everyone wants to see from a public perspective. But also, as Dominic also said, there are a lot of Labour MPs who have not really worked in business, but really have their grounding in things like local government, have worked in the public sector, and what they want to come into this government to do, a lot of them, you know, radicalised by austerity, is to see more money come into their local areas. So I think that pull is incredibly strong. And if plan A of just like, let's just get growth, which, you know, has been tried, doesn't deliver, then I think you end up pulling plan B, which is, okay, we're just going to have higher taxes, which is not on the right, in the right way, on the right people, that means it's not too politically painful.
I agree 100% with that. And we're already starting to see a bit of bending. You know, the test case for this is the benefit cap. Nerve is being held, but they're obviously preparing to do something on this. They've set up a review into child poverty, which we'll recommend, because all the entire sector says get rid of the benefit cap. We'll recommend that the two-child benefit cap is kiboshed. So they're susceptible to pressure in all sorts of ways. And I think it's going to come around tax. It's going to come around service delivery. And you know what? There's going to be moments when Labour secretaries of state are sitting in the office of their departments. They've tried pulling all the levers, and they've tried being really nice to the permanent secretary and the directors general responsible for, you know, big areas of policy, and nothing has happened. And things are still, if it's skewed, you know, I won't say things are still pretty awful. The rags start to be lost, you know. So it's not going to be all sweetness and light. Of course, but it could come sooner than anyone thinks.
That's really interesting, guys. What do we think is the, you know, they've got a big challenge on their hands. Anita, you talked about economic growth, and Gabriel, you said about, you know, things still aren't getting any rosier. What do we think what target do we actually have to hit before the public recognizes this growth and appreciates it, right? We may hit 2%, but actually what does that look of growth? What does that look like in people's work? What do the public expect to see?
Well, the public won't feel growth. Growth is not something that you take to Curry's to buy a new washing machine with. What they will notice is if their mortgage comes down, or they're not refinancing at 5.5%, they're refinancing at 3.5%. They might already have noticed that food prices are going backwards a little bit. You know, a 500 gram of bag of pasta is now 75p in my local Sainsbury's, you know, down from £1 not long ago. They'll start to notice things like that, but they'll also notice, can I get a GP's appointment? Can I get, are people being seen in hospital? Which is why, you know, there's stuff out this morning on this that Wes is clearly determined to settle the junior doctor strike ASAP. So they can start putting runs on the board and saying, look, you know, you faced a 9-month wait for your cataracts operation. You're now going to have it done in 6 weeks' time.
That's great.
Yeah, and I'm always struck by that. Is that I don't know. It's not apocryphal. There's actually a story of an account during the Brexit referendum when a politician said to a voter, it might hit GDP, and the voter said, that's your GDP, not mine. Because like, what does that mean? And I think that Labour is very conscious of the fact that like these tangible benefits, like it takes a long time for them to feed through, first of all, and that's where things like public services are a lot more visible than growth. And that's why the growth is for the public services that therefore make people feel like things work. And it's also a critical point for everyone on this call that things working is not just like the NHS, it's also DVLA, as Gabriel says. It's things that are around the state infrastructure too that make quite a material difference to how people feel.
It's not just the worst off in society either. You know, middle class people use these services as well, which is why, you know, there was again, The Economist is a bit on fire at the moment, but you know, there was such a great piece in The Economist again, I think by Duncan last week, saying that the Lib Dems had done well in lovely England, the loveliest bits of England. You know, they cleaned up in Henley. You know, they got an even bigger majority in Bath. You know, Oxfordshire, the loveliest bits of England, the most deeply, profoundly middle class bits of England have all gone yellow now. And the reason why they have is because those people require CAM services for their kids just as much as someone living in Barnsley does.
I was listening to the president of the Lib Dems, and he said exactly that. He said the potholes appear outside the rich houses now just as much as the poor houses.
Yeah. Yeah. There is such a thing as society. Who knew?
David Cameron, your heart out. There's another great question here about the relationship with London. I might be wrong, but I think it's the first time we've had, well, at least in many places, 3 levels of Labour within government. And I think this applies to London, but also some other authorities where you may have a London-led council, a Labour-led council, a Labour-led regional, and also Labour at the top levels of government. How do you think having one party at all 3 levels is going to impact the sector?
I mean, I'd have to say, sorry, if I jump in. I mean, the hope and expectation is that it leads to much less friction and much better alignment. It doesn't mean that there's going to be a lot more investment because, as we've been talking about, there is no money left, as it were. But I think given that you have a combination of the same parties in power and the centre being quite actively wanting to devolve, and we saw that in the devolution bill announced yesterday, and previous commitments to work together with all the metro mayors, of course, one of them is Conservative, to devolve power down, and for devolution to be, as it were, the default setting. I think it bodes very well. There is, of course, the big caveat that every party is devolutionary in opposition and centralising, or perhaps less devolutionary in government. But I think the fact that we now have metro mayors does change the picture somewhat, because they're not dealing with 300 English councils. They're dealing with that middle layer, which is also the layer where you can get growth happening, because it happens across local authority boundaries in many cases functional economic kind of areas. So I think you can actually get something quite meaty if you devolve power down. And you've got, only last week we saw the West Yorkshire Metro Mayor launching her consultation on the tram system for Leeds and Bradford, which is something that an individual local authority just wouldn't be able to get off the ground. So forgive the pun in terms of trams being on the ground. But I think because we now have that level of sub-regional and regional power, I think that bodes well in terms of the ability to get growth going. Combine it with the fact that there's less friction because they're of the same political party, although you could argue that there's more friction within than without political parties sometimes. I think it's overall positive.
I could make exactly the same point that Dominic made just in his last point. There are a lot of people in Labour HQ who are deeply suspicious of Andy Burnham in a way that Team Gove didn't have to be deeply suspicious of Andy Burnham, for example. And that could be a really interesting dynamic, particularly if they hit choppy water, because Andy has still got the Field Marshal's baton in his knapsack for sure, and is not backwards in coming forward on such moments.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much, guys. And there's another question here from a Matthew Turpin, who's asked, how radical do you guys feel that Labour could be in the respect of planning reform? And do you think there are other other sort of policy areas that they may be looking at, things like zoning and tax credits? And I know these were some things that are actually in Robert Jenrick's planning white paper back in, I think it was 2019. So how much more radical do we think Labour can go on planning, or will go?
Anita, I'll let you go about that.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take that. So I think that this is where the engagement of Rayner will be critical, because I do think, Gabriel kind of typified the sort of the instinct within Labour, which is like, oh, there's a thing that doesn't cost money that businesses are telling me is going to drive growth and everyone thinks will drive growth. Great, let's do that. But that's that's the easy bit, right? Like, Keir Starmer said, done, delete, right? That's the easy bit. When you get into the question of council tax bans, banding, zoning, like these are the things that become very, very difficult. And the question is really, how much can you sustain Labour's interest in a broad and extensive planning reform programme, as opposed to seeing it as one or two things and done? And I think that part of that is businesses being able to go to Labour, go to Matthew, go to Angela, and particularly Matthew, and say, thanks to what you've done here, we've been able to progress here. So they're able to really point to specific wins and examples of progress. And I think without that feedback loop of like, oh, okay, you talked about grey belt, that's why we've decided to kind of develop this piece here, because actually you've made it more permissive. Thanks to your reforms to planning, there's more planning officers. We got this through in 3 months and it would normally take 6. Like those kind of concrete examples and reinforcing that they are doing things that you are responding to as a sector is what is really critical to ensuring it doesn't become a Reeves 6-month project and it becomes the kind of a 5-year project and mission. And remember, housing did not start off as a political objective for Labour. That first mission was all about the highest level of growth in the G7. And the reason why housing became more critical is because various members in the sector, working with clients like Portland, really helped to ensure that they understood the prize that was available. So it's not a given, it's hard fought, and we have to keep fighting for it.
I'd just quickly add to that I think what Labour wants more than planning reform is the stuff that comes out of planning reform, the development and the growth. Yeah. So they've been very clear that they're not going to go for a Gove style zoning system, desirable or not. They're not going to reinvent the system. They're going to work with the grain as much as possible, because it's going to take years to discuss, debate, legislate for, and then get to grips with any new system. And so that's partly why our planning manifesto called for actually not doing stuff, which is perhaps unusual for a manifesto. But we asked for the infrastructure levy not to be introduced and just to stick with SIL and Section 106. It's a system, however imperfect, that the industry knows and can work with or work around as necessary. But at least that's less disruptive than going through a whole brand new system, which will take years to understand and embed in, and will no doubt have its own kinks and problems anyway. So it won't necessarily get you what you want.
Thank you. I'm going to take this a slightly different direction. We actually haven't really spoken a lot about the Conservatives, and they are the official opposition. So I wonder if, well, firstly, when do we think we'll see a new leader, and how strong do we think they can be in opposition with their number of seats? And perhaps what direction do we think the Conservative Party will take, the new leader will take the Conservative Party in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And honestly, like, they couldn't answer, the candidates couldn't answer that question at this stage. I think that one of the things that's very striking when you look at that parliamentary party, the Conservatives that are remaining and actually across the Labour benches, is sort of, where is the opposition going to come from? And by that, I don't mean like the formal opposition, of course, that comes from the Conservatives, but who causes the political U-turns and causes the government to have to move in a direction they don't want? I suspect that as much as the Conservatives will attempt to wound Labour on issues like, for instance, immigration, where it feels like there are vulnerabilities, and to wound on the issues of delivery, that actually you do have some challenges on the Labour benches that could present more opportunities for pivot. So, for instance, the Scottish Conservative Labour, the Scottish Labour bloc will be very significant, because they know that there's a prize there in the Hollywood elections and in kind of killing the momentum for independence. So that voice will be particularly important, for instance. So I think that we should, obviously the Conservatives will be a considerable opposition force in terms of articulating some of those challenges and making the most of those failures, challenges that come up inevitably in government. But are they going to set the terms of success for Labour? I think that there are other parties, and particularly the Lib Dems, if they push themselves to be kind of to the left of Labour, which is where they might be on some of these spending issues. Likewise, the Greens, the Reform pushing them on kind of social issues. the continued saw of kind of Gaza and, you know, Keir Starmer's comments to the Bangladeshi community, all resolvable, but nevertheless, you know, specific tensions within the coalition. That's where I see the main thrust coming from. As to the question of like when this leadership election happens, I mean, the party board yesterday was a total yesterday was a total mess in terms of not being able to figure out like whether there should be an interim leader, the timings of it, how you can do a contest in short order because there are issues around voting online as opposed to having a postal ballot. And obviously there's really 1 week left of a full parliamentary week. So the likelihood that you can decide, announce a timetable and have people whittling down and voting to a final 2 before recess, I'm not convinced it's possible. So I think this runs on for quite a long time.
I think it runs on for ages. I think the Tories face a period of a good couple of years where they basically go away and have a good hard think about who they are and what they're for. Because at the moment, that just seems completely, you know, in the ashes of the early morning of the 5th of July. We're still in those ashes. There is no discernible shape or theme to the Conservative Party at the moment. And I think Anita set out very well. The space for them to operate is quite constricted. You know, you're going to have the Lib Dems, you know, being a kind of free market critical friend of Labour to the left. You're going to have the Greens looking at the youth vote. You've got big problems with the Muslim vote in cities, and you've got Reform, you know, yapping away on the right as well. What is the Conservative Party for? Who is the Conservative Party for? Now, the Conservative Party lost Isha in this election. A Conservative Party that cannot win Isha is a Conservative Party that has lost its soul and lost its raison d'etre, in my view. I would look at, there's some interesting people still in the Conservative Party. I'd look at Neil O'Brien, for example, I think is going to be an interesting presence. It's clearly lining up with Robert Jenrick. I think Kemi is underrated in many ways, although she possibly overrates herself as well. She has some major vulnerabilities. You know, the Conservative Party is not, you know, is not short of some really bright people, but it needs to decide who and what it is for. It can't just be for, as one Tory said, and I wouldn't use this language myself, how did we end up being the party of losers? It can't be that. That's not who it is.
Would either of you be willing to put some money on who you think will be the members will pick?
I've already put 60 quid on Kemi.
They picked the worst person in every leadership election they've been involved in.
I would just say just that we haven't gotten to, and one about Scotland, which I think we sort of touched on, but maybe not.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Nita. Yeah, well, what does Labour's willing to move Scotland? Nita, you've kind of already touched on that. Is there anything else you want to elaborate on?
Well, I think that actually, and this is annoying for some people who want to talk about Scotland, and I end up talking about the whole of the UK. But there is just one thing that I think Scotland illustrates perfectly, which is that 2015, you had Scotland, the SNP winning 57 of the 59 seats. It was extraordinary. And now you have them down to 8. And Dominic talked about the increase in marginal seats, you know, in seats that are don't have these huge majorities where you can feel like, oh, I'm guaranteed to be the MP for X amount of time. And that is a sign of just how much voters are kind of, you know, they're picking and choosing. They're deciding based on, you know, issues that come up then and then, rather than saying to themselves, I am an SNP voter, I am a Labour voter, I am a Conservative voter. So I think that Scotland does tell us, is a perfect illustration of that dynamic that I think we're going to see across all of Westminster, because winning a majority like 400, a majority that Labour has secured this time, most people would be like, oh, okay, you're going to be in power for 10 years, you're going to be in power for 15. That is probably likely, but it's not guaranteed in the way that it used to be. And so I think that in some ways, it's really, and I've done a lot of work in Scotland and lived there for a period of time, and I think that it doesn't necessarily mean the SNP is dead. It absolutely doesn't, and it doesn't also mean that independence is dead in any way. And so I think that actually a lot of it was voters understanding that what they wanted was Labour in power, and therefore they picked Labour in power, rather than saying, actually, we don't think the SNP is a strong voice for Scotland. And I think if Anna Sarwar and the Labour contingent in Scotland, which is so considerable, can win successes for Scotland, then it shows that you don't need to vote for the SNP in national elections in order to have a strong voice for Scotland. So I don't think anything is guaranteed or sewn up now as a result. It's a real boost to the Labour Party and looking ahead to the Hollywood elections, and a real boost to the kind of, but if you look at the support for independence, for instance, it hasn't changed, right? It remains where it was. So it's more about the issues and competence, and the SNP probably suffering from any party that's been in power for 15, 17 years now. So in a way, like, it's interesting because it doesn't necessarily say to us the SNP is now over or busted flush. Although that may still come to fruition, but it's an indication of how voters are becoming transactional in some ways.
Gabriel, Dominic, did you want to come in on anything else on that?
No, I think it was just worth noting that in the election, the Labour's vote share in Wales was actually down nearly 4%. In England, it was up 0.5%, but in Scotland, it was up 13.7%. So really striking. Their comeback, even though they had several routes to victory, was very much in terms of the win in Scotland. I mean, of course, they could have lost every seat there and still had a handsome majority, but it was clearly very significant.
Absolutely. Okay, there's another final question here. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes left. So if you do have any final questions, please get them in now. But for the panel, so there's obviously US elections coming up. We've got lots of elections in Europe. Gafar has asked how much of a role those elections will play to the issues that Labour care about. And I'm thinking particularly probably towards November, how much will that impact Labour's thinking, but also perhaps for Dominic, for us as a sector, and how much that election will impact our sector?
I'm not sure it necessarily will impact our sector. I'm struggling to see what a Trump presidency does for us, apart from perhaps a sort of possible impact on kind of stability and sort of investor sentiment. But I'm not sure there's a direct read through to us. Maybe more demand for housing as some Americans flee.
And for the others, anything that Labour will do differently with these changes in Europe and the US?
Yeah, I think they're really significant, actually, because, and I'm always struck that, what you think you're in government to do is not what you end up doing. And there is a very real world scenario if Trump is elected, that Starmer ends up spending a lot of time on the world stage, particularly if we're looking at crunchy issues like, tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. If the US stays where it is, 100% tariffs, if the EU kind of sticks to its tariffs on EVs, the UK could be an outlier, or it could be, rowing in with some of these partners. I have picked up signals that on the European side, there are going to be further conversations following the kind of Windsor framework on a practical level. So we could see something in terms of progress on closer cooperation with the EU, which is going to take some political capital as well as close working with the Commission. And also, I mean, Ukraine, like, that's something where that Starmer has been, absolutely determined to show that he's hand in glove with Sunak on. And if, with JD Vance and with Donald Trump, I think that landscape looks incredibly different. And then there's a question of, what do you do with your US ambassador appointment? Do you, the Democrats seem to be slightly in awe of Starmer's kind of electoral victory, but that's certainly not the case for Trump. And, so I think that there is a world in which it doesn't derail their priorities in the obvious sense. But I think if the US does create a even more dramatic US first approach to kind of trade and that impacts the kind of world economy, and also if the US if Trump kind of sticks to his current rhetoric around Ukraine, then you could see both a kind of cooling of the economy impacting Starmer's growth ambitions, and also more political capital spent trying to shape the US political direction to support things like peace in Europe. Also, I didn't talk about the radicalism. I mean, I think on this call, we've just seen that I think von der Leyen got re-elected. So yeah, I think that the European Parliament is going to be a lot more unstable. But I think there is a degree of consensus, for good or for ill, amongst the leaders in Europe that I do see continuing. So I think that Europe will continue to be insecure and continue to have these very radical forces that feel destabilizing within its institution. But I don't anticipate that its broad policy direction, being skeptical of China, wanting to cleave closer together, that will change.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anita. I'm conscious of our time, so I want to finish off with a question for each of the panelists. You've all got lots of experience in national government and in local government. So if you were having a conversation with Keir Starmer, what would be your one piece of advice for him as he sets out his new government?
I'll go first. Appoint really good ministers, keep them in post as long as possible. Don't reshuffle just for the sake of presenting a different face to the public. Appoint good people, keep them there, and monitor them, manage them. That is, I think, one of the secrets of effective government, frankly.
Hopefully not 12 housing ministers over 10 years or whatever we've had.
Exactly.
Dominic?
At the risk of sounding horrifically self-interested, I would probably say, and following on from Gabriel's point, which I completely endorse, listen to people who know what they're talking about as well. Whether that's
BPF.
whether that's teachers about education, or perhaps some people may not think that we should listen to teachers, but or whether it's built environment professionals and planners and those involved in the broader piece. Enjoy the expertise of people who want to offer it with goodwill.
Right, Anita?
Oh, my advice is be more political. I think that the way that you win sometimes reinforces a kind of blinkered approach to how you should govern. And I think that Starmer has won by incrementally taking decisions that make sense to him and then seeing where he ends up. And he has taken them by being relatively pragmatic, but not necessarily political in how he thinks about problems, and not having, I would say, a kind of gut instinct about where the party should be and bringing it there, but more like going, fix this problem, then this problem, then this problem, then this problem. I'm not sure that's a good blueprint for how you govern when things come at you very, very fast and you don't have time to kind of to go systematically through a problem. And I think that's almost in some ways a rejection of the way Corbyn behaved, right? Which is much more that sort of, okay, so what's the ideology and then where do we go? So I think that there is probably, I say this so much, that becoming Prime Minister is almost like acquiring a superpower, where everything that you're great at is amplified, but everything you're bad at is amplified too. And I just think there is, Starmer is not the most political, is probably the least political Prime Minister that we've had for some time. And that is going to make being Prime Minister quite challenging. And some of those early tests and ability for him to kind of think, okay, well, what's the politics here? What's my gut? And going with that will kind of reinforce and hopefully give him confidence that he can just go with his gut and not have to do a whole process to see where things land. Because that's kind of how you can govern effectively when the spotlight is on you in that way. So.
Thank you, Nita, and that's some great advice from everyone. We're going to pull this to a close, and I just want to say a huge thank you to our wonderful panelists and a big virtual round of applause. If you have any questions on what the BPF is doing, or if you need any support, there is, of course, get in contact with Dominic and the team. And of course, if there is anything that you need to either understand Labour or help lobby the government, please do speak with our fantastic panelists from Portland Communications. And a big thank you to Emily and the team at the BPF who put this fantastic event together. So big thank you to everyone, and it'll be interesting to see where we get to in the budget over the next few weeks and then beyond. So thank you so much to our panelists.